Ryan Cole heard the knock just after 9, and when he opened his front door, the last person in the world he expected to find standing on his porch was Vivienne Marsh. She wasn't wearing the boardroom the way she usually did, blazer still on, but the collar loosened, hair coming free from its pins in soft dark pieces around her face, the porch light catching something warm in her expression that had no business existing on the woman who had spent the last 3 weeks taking his work apart in front of a full conference room. "Can I come in?" she asked, and her voice didn't have a single trace of the register she used at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday to make grown professionals feel like interns. Ryan stood there, one hand still on the door, and for a moment he genuinely couldn't find words. Whatever brought Vivienne Marsh to his actual house at 9 o'clock at night, it wasn't a spreadsheet. Behind him, down the hall, a nightlight glowed faintly under his daughter's door, and he found himself, absurdly, hoping Vivienne hadn't noticed it yet. She had. Of course she had. Vivienne Marsh noticed everything. That, it turned out, was about to become the whole problem. If you want to know why the coldest woman in that entire firm ended up on a single dad's porch after everything she'd put him through, stay with me, because I need to take you back 3 weeks first. Vivienne Marsh ran her firm the way a surgeon runs an operating table, precisely, without sentiment, and with absolutely no patience for anything that looked like carelessness dressed up as an excuse. Ryan Cole had been on the receiving end of that precision more times in the last month than in his previous 2 years combined. There was the Tuesday she'd stopped mid-sentence in front of the whole account team to point out a typo in his client deck cost, not coast, missed Cole. Though I suppose either word describes what this error is about to do to our margin, and let the silence that followed do the rest of the work. There was the morning he'd walked in 6 minutes late, having spent the previous hour convincing a feverish 7-year-old that oatmeal was in fact an acceptable breakfast, and Vivienne had looked at her watch, then at him, and said, "I trust whatever kept you was worth the client noticing," in a tone that made it clear she assumed it wasn't. There was the slide, formatted a hair off from the template, that she'd projected onto the main screen for the entire floor to see while she asked, evenly, whether anyone on his team had actually reviewed it before sending it to her. Ryan took each one without flinching outwardly, the way he'd learned to take most things over the last 3 years, quietly, methodically, filing the sting away somewhere it wouldn't slow him down before the next task. He never explained himself. He never mentioned Mia, not once. Not to Vivienne, not to almost anyone at the office. Work was work. Home was the one thing he'd built that nobody got to pick apart, and he intended to keep it that way. At home, the mornings ran on a schedule only a single father learns to keep. Up at 5:40. Lunch packed the night before. A small chalkboard on the kitchen wall that Mia had started keeping not long after her mother died, a running tally she called days since, though she'd never fully explained what came after those 2 words, and Ryan had never made her. Some mornings the number climbed higher than either of them liked to look at directly. Ryan erased it and rewrote it each day without comment, the way you tend a wound you've decided not to discuss out loud. Mia was 7. Missing a front tooth, endlessly curious about things adults had stopped wondering about years ago: why dogs sniffed each other, why the moon followed the car, whether her mother could see the chalkboard from wherever she was now. Ryan answered what he could and let the rest sit, the way you let most impossible questions sit when you're raising a child alone. He'd never told Vivienne any of it. Not because he was ashamed, but because in 3 years he'd learned that the moment people at work knew he was a single dad, they either treated him like a walking cautionary tale or expected him to explain every late arrival for the rest of his career. Neither option appealed to him. Better, he'd decided, to just be good at the job and let the mornings stay his own business. There was one more, the worst of the month, that Ryan still thought about more than he'd have admitted to anyone. He'd fallen asleep at Mia's bedside the night before a major client presentation, exhausted past the point of setting an alarm properly, and woken to find he'd missed the 7 a.m. prep call entirely. He'd walked into the actual client meeting 11 minutes late, breathless, having sprinted the last 2 blocks, and Vivian had simply looked at him across the conference table, unhurried, and said, "I do hope whatever kept you was worth the impression we just made," loud enough for the client to hear every word of it. He hadn't explained. He never did. He'd simply nodded, sat down, and delivered the best pitch of his career on pure adrenaline and spite. And nobody in that room had any idea what either of those things had cost him. The trouble was, lately, he wasn't quite managing to be good enough at the job to make that math work. Grace, Ryan's assistant and closest thing to a friend on the floor, watched the pattern from the sidelines with the particular helplessness of someone who liked her job too much to intervene directly. She'd covered for him twice already that month, smoothing a late arrival here, quietly fixing a formatting slip there, before it reached Vivian's desk, but there's only so much smoothing one assistant can do before the cracks show anyway. It finally slipped out on a Thursday, in the kitchenette, when Vivian came in for coffee and found Grace still visibly rattled from watching Ryan get taken apart in the 2 o'clock meeting over a missed decimal point. "He's not careless," Grace said, before she'd fully decided to say anything at all. "He's raising a 7-year-old by himself. His wife died 3 years ago. He gets her up, fed, dressed, and on a bus every single morning before he's even opened his laptop. And then he comes in here and gets torn apart over a decimal, because nobody's ever bothered to ask why he looks so tired." The words hung in the small kitchenette a beat too long before Grace realized exactly what she'd done. Vivian didn't respond right away. She stood very still, coffee cup halfway to her mouth, something moving behind her eyes that Grace had never once seen on her in 4 years of working there. "I didn't know that," Vivian said finally, quietly. "No," Grace said, some old loyalty to Ryan making her hold her ground even now. "You wouldn't. He's never told anyone. He doesn't like people knowing." Vivian set the coffee down without drinking it, and left the kitchenette without another word. She spent the rest of that afternoon behind her closed office door, and when she finally emerged near 7 that evening, long after most of the floor had cleared out, her assistant noted, though she'd never say so to anyone but her own diary, that Vivian Marsh looked, for the first time anyone could remember, genuinely shaken. She thought about every sharp correction she'd delivered in the last month. The typo, the 6 minutes, the slide projected for the whole floor to see. Each one replaying now with a different weight attached to it. The weight of a man who'd spent that same morning convincing a sick child that oatmeal was breakfast, who'd been carrying an entire household on his own for 3 years, while she'd stood in front of a room and made his exhaustion into a public lesson about standards. She didn't sleep well that night. By the next evening, she found herself in her car outside an address pulled from an old HR file she had absolutely no professional reason to be looking at. Engine off, staring at a porch light for longer than she'd ever admit to anyone, before finally getting out and walking up to knock. If you've ever said something too sharp to someone whose whole story you didn't know yet, you already understand exactly what Vivian was feeling standing on that porch. Stay with me, because this is where we go back to that door. "Can I come in?" she'd asked, and Ryan, still too stunned to do anything but step aside, let her. She stood in his small entryway looking, for the first time since he'd known her, entirely out of her element. No glass conference room to anchor her, no clipboard, no room full of people deferring to her. Just a modest house with shoes lined up by the door in descending size, and a child's drawing taped crookedly to the hallway wall. "I'm not here about work," she said, before he could ask. "I came to apologize. Properly. Not the kind you give in front of people." Ryan crossed his arms, more out of habit than defense. "For which part?" "All of it," Vivian said. The typo. The morning you were late, the slide I put up on the screen for everyone to see. The client meeting. When you'd fallen asleep at your daughter's bedside, and I made a joke about it in front of people who didn't need to hear it. She paused, and something in her composure cracked by exactly 1 degree, the way a door opens just wide enough to let a draft through. I didn't know about your daughter. Ryan, I didn't know about your wife. I found out this afternoon, secondhand, and I've spent every hour since trying to figure out how to say I'm sorry in a way that doesn't sound like something I'm only saying because I got caught not knowing. Ryan didn't answer right away. He glanced down the hall, toward Mia's door, toward the soft glow of her night light, and something in his chest loosened slightly, the specific relief of not having to keep a secret quite so carefully anymore. At least in this one room. I don't tell people at work, he said finally. Not because I'm ashamed. Because the second people know, they either treat you like you're fragile, or they expect an explanation every time you're 2 minutes late. I wasn't fair to you, Vivian said. I was fair to a version of you I made up, because it was easier than asking questions. You weren't the only one, Ryan said, not unkindly, just honestly. I built it that way on purpose. Vivian looked around the small living room again, the drawing on the wall, a chalkboard visible through the kitchen doorway, with something written and half erased on it, a life that had never once needed to look impressive for anyone. And something in her posture eased, degree by degree, the way a coat settles once someone finally stops holding themselves rigid. Can I sit for a minute? She asked. I know it's late. He nodded toward the front step instead of the couch. Some instinct telling him this conversation belonged outside, under the porch light, not inside where Mia might wake and wonder who was in the house. Vivian followed him out, and after a moment, without any particular ceremony, she slipped off her heels and set them beside the door, sitting down on the step in stocking feet like the gesture cost her something, and gave her something back in equal measure. I was married once, she said, looking out at the quiet street instead of at him. To a business partner, actually. He knew every professional weakness I ever admitted to him, and when things ended, he used every one of them. Precisely, efficiently, the way you'd expect from someone who'd learned strategy from watching me practice it. A dry, humorless breath. I decided after that, gentleness was a liability. That severity was just another word for standards, if you said it with enough confidence. Ryan sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. And tonight, Vivian said quietly, I found out that a man I've been calling careless for a month gets up every day and does something considerably harder than anything on my calendar, and I never once thought to ask why he looked tired. She turned to look at him, something raw and unguarded moving across her face. I don't know what to do with how that's sitting in my chest right now. You could start, Ryan said, by not doing it again. I'd like to do more than that, she said, and the honesty of it surprised them both. If this is landing somewhere for you, hit that like button, because Monday morning is where this whole thing gets tested, and I promise you it doesn't stay this easy. Monday arrived the way it always does after a weekend that mattered too much, and Vivian walked onto the floor in full armor blazer buttoned, hair pinned back into its usual precision, heels announcing her 3 seconds before she appeared. Ryan half expected the whole porch conversation to have evaporated overnight, filed away the way difficult truths sometimes are, when Monday's fluorescent light makes everything feel less real than it did the night before. It nearly went that way. In the 10 o'clock review, she opened his slide deck, and for a fraction of a second, Ryan watched her jaw tighten in exactly the shape it took right before one of her precise public corrections. She caught herself. He watched her catch herself, watched the correction die in her throat, watched her exhale once, slow and deliberate, before she said instead, evenly, "This needs one adjustment on slide 4. Let's take it offline," and moved on to the next item without another word. Nobody else in the room seemed to notice anything unusual. Ryan noticed everything. That evening, the floor mostly emptied. He found himself in her office doorway with a genuine work question, and she waved him in, closing the door herself once he was through it, a small, deliberate gesture that hadn't existed between them a week earlier. "You almost said something in the review," Ryan said. "I almost said several things," Vivian admitted. "Old habits are precise for a reason. They're efficient. It's very hard to stop reaching for a tool you've used successfully for a decade." "What stopped you?" She considered the question longer than it probably needed. "I kept thinking about a chalkboard," she said finally, "and a number I didn't understand, and how little it would have cost me this whole time to simply ask instead of assume." She looked at him directly. "I've spent years believing that caring about people individually made me worse at running this place. That the partner who never gets attached makes the harder, better decisions." Her voice thinned at the edges, but held. "I'm starting to think I just built an entire career defense around one bad marriage, and called it professionalism because that sounded better than what it actually was." Ryan didn't rush to fill the silence with easy comfort. He just let it sit. The way you let most true things sit before responding to them. "For what it's worth," he said eventually, "the version of you that showed up on my porch was the first version of you I've ever actually wanted to work for." Something in her face opened at that, unguarded in a way her office rarely saw. "That's dangerously close to a compliment, Mr. Cole. I contain multitudes," he said, and for the first time since he'd known her, Vivian Marsh laughed a real one, surprised out of her, quick and warm, and entirely unlike anything the boardroom had ever heard. 2 days later, she showed up at his house again, this time with a paper bag from the bakery near the office, and absolutely no pretext of apology to hide behind. Mia answered the door before Ryan could get there, having apparently decided that anyone who knocked after dinner deserved an immediate, thorough interview. "Are you the mean boss lady?" Mia asked, entirely without malice, the way only a 7-year-old can ask a genuinely devastating question and make it sound like small talk. Vivian, to her enormous credit, didn't flinch. "I think I probably was," she said honestly, crouching down to Mia's eye level. "I'm trying to be a better one." Mia studied her with the frank, unhurried attention only a child can manage. "Did you bring the good donuts or the boring ones?" "I have no idea," Vivian admitted. "I panicked and bought 6 kinds." Mia considered this answer with the gravity of a seasoned negotiator, then apparently decided it was sufficient. Because she took Vivian's hand without asking permission from anyone, and led her straight to the kitchen table, chattering the entire way about the chalkboard, about the moon following the car, about whether Vivian knew that dogs could smell fear. A fact Mia found both alarming and delightful in equal measure. Ryan stood in the doorway, watching his daughter pull a woman he'd feared for a month into the easy orbit of an ordinary Tuesday evening, and felt something in his chest give way that he hadn't expected to give way so completely, or so soon. If you've ever watched a child see straight through to the good in someone before the adults around them caught up, you know exactly what this moment felt like. Stay close, because what happens next is the part that almost falls apart before it gets to stay. It scared her, in the end, exactly the way these things always do. Vivian pulled back hard the following week, retreating into the armor with a speed that told Ryan she'd felt something on that kitchen floor far bigger than donuts and small talk. Something that had frightened her enough to reach for the one tool she'd spent a decade trusting. She corrected him publicly on a Thursday, sharp and precise, over something so minor Ryan almost laughed at how deliberately manufactured the moment felt. A font size, of all things, projected onto the main screen the way she used to do it. Her voice carrying the old flat register she'd been leaving behind for 2 weeks. The room went quiet in the familiar way. A few colleagues lowered their eyes. Ryan waited until the meeting cleared, then knocked on her office door, and closed it himself before she could object. That wasn't about a font, he said. Vivian didn't look up from her screen. It was precisely about a font. Vivian, her name, said plainly, the way he'd said it on his own porch step. You don't have to do this. Her hands went still on the keyboard. When she finally looked up, the composure had a crack running straight through the center of it. I don't know how to want something and not immediately calculate every way it could be used against me later, she admitted. It's not a switch I know how to turn off just because a 7-year-old handed me a donut and decided I wasn't so terrible. Nobody's asking you to turn anything off, Ryan said. I'm asking you to trust that this isn't your marriage. I'm not him. I've spent 3 years building a life where nothing about me gets to be used as a weapon. Because I built it entirely around a kid who needs me steady more than she needs me impressive. He stepped closer. You're the only person who's ever made me want to let someone see past that. And I don't fully know what to do with that either. But I'd rather figure it out than watch you disappear behind a font size every time it gets real. The silence that followed held real weight. The kind that either breaks something or finally lets it become true. Vivian looked at him a long moment. Something raw and unguarded finally winning out over a decade of careful strategy. I'm frightened, she said simply. I haven't said that word out loud to anyone in years. That's a start, Ryan said gently. If this story's found you at the right moment, share it with someone who needs the reminder that the bravest thing anyone can do is stop mistaking armor for strength. Because what happens next is the part that finally lets this settle. She showed up at his door again the following Saturday. No pretext this time, no bakery bag, no apology needed. She'd taken her hair down before she even reached the porch, and when Ryan opened the door, she was simply standing there in the porch light, the way she had that very first night, except this time nothing about her expression was bracing for a difficult conversation. Can I come in? She asked, and it was the same question from 3 weeks earlier, except every word in it meant something entirely different now. Always, Ryan said, and stepped aside. Mia met them in the hallway, already halfway through explaining an elaborate theory involving the moon, the car, and possibly her mother, and Vivian crouched down without hesitation to hear the rest of it, the way she'd learned. In 3 short weeks was simply the right way to enter this particular house. Later, the 3 of them sat around the kitchen table, with the chalkboard visible on the wall behind them. Its careful, erasable number rewritten fresh that morning the way it always was. And Vivian found herself laughing, really laughing. The full, unguarded kind at something Mia said about dogs and fear, and the general unfairness of bedtime. Ryan watched her across the table. This woman who'd once dismantled him in front of an entire floor for a decimal point, now sitting in his kitchen with her shoes by the door and her guard entirely gone, and understood that some of the best things arrive precisely because someone was finally brave enough to knock a second time. On purpose, after the first knock had only been an apology. Before bed, Mia had insisted on showing Vivian the chalkboard properly, walking her through the ritual with the seriousness of a small tour guide. This is where Dad erases it. This is where he writes the new number. This is the part where we don't talk about it too much, because some days it's easier not to. Vivian had knelt in front of it for a long moment, reading the small, careful numbers, and said nothing at all, which turned out to be exactly the right response, because Mia had simply nodded, satisfied, and gone to find her toothbrush. Same time next week? Vivian asked quietly, once Mia had gone to bed, and the kitchen had gone soft and gold under the evening light. Every week, if you want it, Ryan said. She reached across the table and laced her fingers through his, the gesture costing her nothing at all this time. And the ordinary Saturday evening held them both like it had been waiting a long while for exactly this to finally arrive. If this story found you at the right moment, give it a like. Share it with someone who needs to hear that gentleness was never actually a weakness. Subscribe for more.